Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, the 13 worst books I've read this year. So this is the first of 4 videos you're going to get this week talking about my most memorable reads of 2024. So not necessarily books that came out in 2024, but books I read this year. So today you're going to get my 13 worst books that I read in 2024. Later this week you'll get my top 10 crime reads of 2024, my top 10 horror reads, and my top 10 other reads. So other being books that are neither crime nor horror. So yeah, today the 13 worst books I read this year. And worst is probably the wrong term. It's more disappointing. These are not books I'm angry with, they're just books I'm disappointed with. 2 of these books, in fact, were books I had read before and remembered really fondly. But I think pretty much all of these books are books I had high expectations for, books I'd heard good things about. But for me, it just didn't work for a number of different reasons. And there are 2 authors, in fact, who are on today's list, the worst of list, but have also made it onto at least one of the best of lists. Anyway, let me get on and tell you what the books are. So the first is I Was a Teenage Slasher by Stephen Graham Jones. Stephen Graham Jones is an author I really like. I think My Heart is a Chainsaw and The Only Good Indians are both excellent horror novels, but this one just didn't work for me. So it's about a high school kid who becomes a horror movie slasher type character, and that kind of transition just didn't work for me. I found it really difficult to balance my sympathy for him as a character with the brutality of the crimes that he commits. I just felt like Stephen Graham Jones didn't quite manage to make those 2 things fit together well enough. The second book is by another author I really, really admire, Patricia Highsmith. So I've been reading all of her books over the last couple of years. I think she was a phenomenal author of crime fiction. Her final book, Small G, A Summer Idyll, was very disappointing for me. It felt unfinished. It felt like she hadn't properly worked through her concepts for the books. It's a book that was published posthumously, so maybe that's why. But it follows a group of characters centering around this gay bar. And for me, I just wasn't interested in the characters. There was no real drama in the book. It just didn't pull me in the same way that her work normally does. So, yeah, a very disappointing book. Next, a book I had really high hopes for. I've heard so many great things about this book. And again, it just didn't work for me. I didn't connect with the characters. I didn't connect with the story at all. That book is The Devil Takes You Home by Gabino, Iglesias. So yes, so many people have raved about this book. I know a number of people who, put this as one of their favourite books of the year, but it just failed to pull me in. So it's a very disturbing book about a guy who gets drawn into a life of crime because he's trying to raise money to save his daughter's life. But yeah, for me, it just didn't work. Next is a book that was very highly praised when it came out, won some awards, but for me, I just felt like it didn't deal well enough with the subject matter it was about, and that is In the Blink of an Eye by Jo Callaghan. So this is a detective novel about artificial intelligence. So there's a duo of detectives at the heart of this book, one of whom is an AI. And for me, that examination of AI was kind of interesting at times, but also quite boring and mundane at other times. And also, as a thriller, I just felt like it fumbled a lot of its plot points. It just didn't hang together as a satisfying read for me. Next up is a sequel to a book I absolutely loved. So the book I loved was Jack's Return Home, which was famously filmed as Get Carter. The sequel, also by the same author, Ted Lewis, is Jack Carter's Law. So this is actually like a prequel to Jack's Return Home. So Jack's Return Home follows this London gangster who goes back to his hometown up north in the UK to investigate his brother's death. Jack Carter's Law is, as I say, a prequel and focuses on his kind of activities as a gangster in London. And it just felt cliched. It was written, kind of in the 60s. So before a lot of the kind of cliches that it uses became cliches, if that makes sense. But it still felt cliched to me. It felt kind of tired, quite misogynist, and just not particularly interesting. So yeah, very disappointing after Jack's Return Home, which I thought was a phenomenally good book. Next, a book I've been wanting to read for ages, which ended up being a complete dud, and that was TNT by Doug Masters. So this is the American edition of a French book, the first in a series of men's adventure books about this guy TNT, who's kind of a superhuman kind of character, and it was just really over the top and ridiculous. And sometimes that could work for this kind of book, but in this case, it just felt ludicrous. It wasn't enjoyable. It was quite unpleasant at times. There's a scene towards the end which really kind of turned my stomach a little bit, and not in a good way. I don't mind having my stomach turned in books, but this was just beyond the pale. So yeah, just a crazy book, and sometimes that kind of craziness in men's adventure books can be really, really fun, but in this case it didn't work at all. Next, Deliver Me by Elle Nash. So Elle Nash is an author I've heard loads of great things about, and I was looking forward to reading this. And I will try more of her work, but this one just didn't work. So this is kind of a Southern Gothic, very disturbing at times, with a big twist at the end that just felt like it didn't really fit with the rest of the book. It's about a young woman living on a trailer park in one of the southern states. And someone in the comments on my video review of this said that it felt like a book written by someone who'd read books about that kind of life rather than someone who had lived that kind of life. And I think that's true. It just kind of feels like it lacks authenticity, this book. And as a result, it didn't really work for me. Next up, a book by my favourite author of all time, Evan Hunter. This is The Chisholms. So this is a Western he wrote about a family kind of pioneering, like travelling across the States. So a Western, the only Western he wrote. And for me, it was just a bit disappointing. It was fine, it was okay, but it felt like too many of those other kind of big blockbuster type books of the 70s, which is exactly what it was. It was turned into a TV miniseries. It got kind of the full 70s blockbuster treatment. But yeah, for me, I just didn't engage with the characters in the way that I normally engage with characters in Evan Hunter's books. And it just fell a bit flat for me. It ended up feeling like a bit of a slog. Next, another book that was a reread, or actually the first book that was a reread for me, that is Dirty Weekend by Helen Zahavi. So this is a book that came out in the early 90s, and I read it when it came out, and it was kind of considered to be a feminist response to American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis at the time. It was kind of quite highly lauded in the by reviewers and things like that at the time. It's dated really badly. So it's about this woman living in Brighton, which is a local city to me, and where I was living at the time that I first read the book, in fact, who gets attacked and goes on a kind of revenge spree against various men, some of whom have directly wronged her, and others of whom she just feels aggrieved by generally. And it just doesn't really work. And I think largely it's because it's a book that's so full of anger, it doesn't take time to actually try and construct a proper story. But also because it's dated horrifically in terms of some of its other views. So it definitely stands up as a kind of feminist book, but it's also quite homophobic and really racist at times, which just felt very, very jarring. Next, a newer book, and one by an author I'd heard great things about. That was Ghost Station by S.A. Barnes. So this is kind of a sci-fi horror book. And like The Devil Takes You Home by Gabino Iglesias, it just didn't work for me. I just didn't feel like I had any sort of connection with the characters or events of the plot. It's got some interesting ideas in it, and it definitely has some creepy bits, and an interesting kind of political corporate backstory to it as well. But I just failed to get swept along by the story. And again, it felt like a book that was a bit of an effort to read by the end. Next, the second reread. This is Army of Devils by Dick Stivers from the Able Team series. So this is a series of men's adventure books about a group of guys who go up against terrorists and so on. This is a book I first read, I think, in either the late 80s or early 90s, and I remembered it being absolutely crazy, really over the top. So in this book, there is a drug that's doing the rounds in the city Able Team operate in that sends people absolutely crazy, sends them homicidally crazy, and also makes them super strong. And I remembered it feeling a bit like a zombie movie in terms of just this unrelenting horde of baddies coming at the three heroes. but it's not nearly as over the top as I remembered. There are a couple of scenes that are like that are like incredibly violent, but overall it just felt like a bit of a slog, and a bit of a slog that had some really dubious politics in it as well. Next up, another kind of new horror book, Night House by Jo Nesbo. So Nesbo is an author whose crime books I really want to read. I have tried one of them ages ago, and didn't get on with it. I didn't get on with it at the time, but I definitely want to go back to his work. But The Night House, which is a horror book, just didn't work for me. Parts of it are great. The opening, which feels a bit like kind of a Goosebumps book, I found really, really interesting and engaging. But as the kind of scope of the books expands, it becomes more and more ridiculous. And I just felt like it didn't hang together properly as a result. The final book then is another book that loads of people seem to really, really love. That's Hawk Mountain by Conor Habib. And I can see why people like it. So the first half of this book I thought was excellent, and in fact reminded me of Patricia Highsmith. So it's about this guy who is divorced from his wife. He's the kind of parent, the sole parent for his son. And this guy who he had a weird relationship in high school turns up out of the blue and kind of inserts himself into their life. So it's a book that really examines kind of bullying, and just it has a sense of being just uncomfortable. There's almost this kind of embarrassment to the fact that this guy's inserted himself into their lives and he just can't get rid of them. He just doesn't know how to behave. But as the book progresses and there's a big twist halfway through, I just found it became unpleasant to read. I really didn't like the twist. There was a subtlety to the first half of the book that I felt got completely lost in the second half, and as a result I ended up not enjoying it at all. So there you have my 13 most disappointing reads of the year. I'm sure there are people out there who are shaking their fists at the screen because they love some of the books I've talked about. So do let me know in the comments if there are any you particularly disagree with me on. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.